There's a specific kind of anger that doesn't have a clean target. It's not at your husband exactly, not at your job, not at your kids, not at any one thing you could point to and say, there, that's what this is about. It's at all of it and none of it. And because it has no address, you end up directing it at the only person who's always available, yourself. You call it ingratitude. You call it a bad week. You call it something you need to get under control before it costs you something you can't afford to lose. But what if getting it under control is exactly the wrong move? Not because the anger is fine to act on, but because suppressing it means missing the most honest signal your system has produced in years. Today, we're going to give that anger a name. And the name changes what it means. Which changes what you do with it. Which changes, eventually, how much of yourself you've been using just to keep it quiet. Let's start by describing it accurately. Because the way midlife anger actually feels is almost never how it gets described. It doesn't usually arrive as a roar. It arrives as a tightness, a very specific kind of impatience that sits just below the surface, low-grade and constant, like a pilot light that never goes out. And then something small happens. A comment that shouldn't matter, a plan that gets changed without asking, the specific tone of voice someone uses when they need something from you. And the reaction is not proportionate to the thing. You know it isn't. And that gap between the size of the trigger and the size of the response is where the shame comes from. Because here's what the gap actually means. The trigger isn't the source, it's the match. The fuel has been accumulating for a long time, and so begins the cycle that a lot of women in midlife know without ever having named it out loud. The anger surfaces. It feels disproportionate. She suppresses it, quickly, efficiently, the way she's learned to. The guilt arrives immediately after. The suppression makes the next eruption more likely, and the whole thing begins again. Research on this pattern, the relationship between emotional suppression and intensified anger response, shows something consistent. The more reliably a woman has learned to contain her anger, the more physiologically activated she becomes when it surfaces. The containment doesn't reduce the anger. It pressurizes it. So the anger that comes from nowhere? It didn't come from nowhere. It came from everywhere she swallowed it before. And if you've been swallowing it for 20 years, the pressure doesn't announce a reason, it just arrives. Now here's where it gets important. Because there are actually two things happening simultaneously, and most explanations only give you one of them. The first is neurological. Estrogen does something that almost no one tells women before perimenopause. It acts as a buffer in the brain's emotional regulation system. Specifically, it modulates the amygdala, the structure responsible for threat detection and emotional reactivity. When estrogen levels begin fluctuating, that buffer becomes unreliable. The amygdala becomes more reactive. Responses that were previously filtered now arrive faster, louder, closer to the surface. The Seattle Midlife Women's Health Study, one of the longest-running investigations into the perimenopausal transition, found that anger and irritability intensify measurably during the perimenopausal window, not as a mood disorder, not as a personal failing, as a neurologically predictable response to a specific hormonal shift. This is not, it's just hormones used to dismiss her. This is the opposite. It is the science finally catching up to what she has been living in her body and confirming that what she felt was real, and it had a mechanism, and the mechanism is neither her fault nor her permanent condition. But, and this is the part that gets left out, the neurological piece is only half the picture, because estrogen fluctuation explains why the anger is louder right now. It does not explain what the anger is about. And that second layer, the identity layer, is where the real information lives. Here is what keeps appearing, in study after study, in clinical work with women in midlife. The perimenopausal window doesn't create the anger. It removes the neurological padding that allowed women to keep functioning, while something underneath went unaddressed for years. The anger was always there. Perimenopause just made it harder to contain, which means the question is no longer, how do I get the anger back under control? The question is, what has it been trying to say and why now? Diffuse anger, the kind with no clear address, is almost never random. In the research on midlife women's emotional experience, and in the clinical patterns that keep appearing across different lives, different relationships, different circumstances, the anger without a target tends to be pointing at one of three things. Not always all three, sometimes one, sometimes two. But the pattern is consistent enough to be worth naming. The first, Accumulated constraint. This is the anger of a woman who has spent years making herself smaller to fit a space that was designed around everyone else's needs. Not because she was forced to, because she chose to freely, from love, for good reasons. The problem with freely chosen constraint is that it doesn't feel like a loss while it's happening. It feels like maturity, like wisdom, like love. It only starts to feel like something else when the constraint has been running long enough that she can no longer remember what she wanted before she agreed to it. The second, invisible labor that was never named. This is the anger of a woman who has been carrying the cognitive and emotional weight of a household, a family, a relationship, and who has been thanked for the visible parts while the invisible parts accumulated in silence. The mental load research is unambiguous on this. The invisible management work in most households falls disproportionately and persistently on women. And the thing about invisible labor is not just that it's exhausting, it's that it's epistemically invisible, even to the person doing it. She cannot always name what she's been carrying. She just knows she's tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. The third, the self that was set down and never retrieved. This is the deepest layer. And it is the one that generates the most shame, because it is the hardest to justify. How do you explain that you are angry about a version of yourself you voluntarily set aside? How do you grieve what you freely chose? The answer is, grief doesn't ask whether the loss was justified. Grief asks what is gone. And somewhere in the part of her that doesn't always get to run the conversation, there is a woman who has been quietly tallying the answer to that question for years. So here is what is actually happening when the anger arrives with no address. It is not at your husband. It is not at your kids. It is not, fundamentally, at any of the specific triggers that seem to set it off. It is the accumulated pressure of years of constraint, invisible labor, and a self that was never given room to breathe, finally surfacing in a body whose neurological buffer is no longer strong enough to keep it quiet. The anger isn't at everything. It was always at something very specific, something that has been trying to get your attention for a long time. That is not a symptom. That is the most honest signal your system has ever sent you. If this opens something you need to go further with, there is a resource in the description built specifically for what comes next. 4 modules that walk through the specific targets and messages of midlife anger, so it stops being something to manage and starts being something you can actually read. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Now, the objection that is probably already present. Even if I understand all of this, I still can't afford to let the anger out. Too much depends on me staying even. The kids, the relationship, the job. Understanding why I'm angry doesn't change the fact that I cannot become someone who rages. That is a completely rational concern. And this is important. Nothing here is an argument for expressing the anger without consideration of what it costs. The goal is not expression. The goal is translation. There is a meaningful difference between suppressing the anger as if it were wrong, the way she has been doing for years, which pressurizes it, and acknowledging the anger as information, which begins to release the pressure without requiring her to detonate anything. Suppression says, this should not be here. Translation says, this is here, and it is saying something. Let me listen. The practical entry point into translation is small. It does not require confrontation. It does not require a confession. It does not require her to change anything tonight. It requires only this. The next time the anger arrives, instead of moving immediately to suppress it or justify it, pause, just for a moment, and ask, what is the constraint this is responding to? Not, why am I being irrational? Not, what is wrong with me today? Just, what is constrained here that wants to be unconstrained? That pause, that single reframe is what begins to interrupt the suppression cycle, because the cycle runs on a premise that the anger is evidence of dysfunction and must be contained before it does damage. The pause replaces that premise with a different one. The anger is evidence of something real that deserves to be understood before it is dismissed. That is not a technique for managing anger. It is the beginning of listening to yourself after years of being very, very good at not doing that. And it's worth saying clearly, this is not going to resolve in one video. The anger has been accumulating for years. The decoding takes time. The translation is not always comfortable, but the alternative, continuing to treat the most honest signal her system produces as a problem to be controlled, costs something she has already been paying for too long. It costs her access to herself. If this names something you want to take further, the resource in the description goes deeper into the specific targets, the specific messages, and what to actually do with what the anger is telling you. Link in the description. Also in the pinned comment, what does your anger tend to land on? And sitting with this now, what do you think it might actually be trying to say? Here is what to leave with tonight. Not a plan. Not a next step. Just this. The anger that has been frightening you. The one that arrives too big for its trigger, that has no clean address, that you have been swallowing and apologizing for and carrying alone. That anger is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that something has been wrong with the amount of room you have been given and given yourself for decades. That is a completely different diagnosis. The women who feel this most acutely are not the ones who failed to manage their emotions correctly. They are almost always the ones who manage them too well, for too long, at too high a cost to themselves. The competence that made the anger invisible is the same competence that is now making it unavoidable. She didn't disappear overnight. She disappeared in increments. And the anger that has no name, it is the part of her that is done with the increments. This doesn't get resolved tonight. The target, the anger, is pointing at the constraint, the invisible weight, the self that was set down. Those are not things that dissolve with understanding. Understanding is the beginning, not the conclusion. But here is what tonight gives you. One thing to hold when the anger arrives again at 2 a.m. and the voice immediately moves to shame. The anger that has no target, it has a target. It's just that the target is large and old, and so woven into everything you love, that pointing at it has always felt like pointing at the sky. It isn't pointing at the sky, it's pointing at something specific. And now you know what to listen for. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly where this starts.